Minnie Mouse pad.
No.
Yeah, let's
Let's hit that one. We turn off our cell phone. I just remind myself to turn off my own personal cell phone here. Good evening. In case we have different people coming in, I just stand very far from the can everybody hear me? I turned it off already. Yes. Good evening. I'm Ming Fung, the director of the graduate program at SCI-Arc, and I'd like to welcome to our visitors who come here to our lecture series at SCI-Arc. This evening, we are faced with a difficult choice. Some of you, including myself, would like to be at two different places. Because right now we're missing one of the more important events, and that is the final debate between President Bush and Senator John Kerry. And many people would like to think that the outcome of this debate would influence the future of this country and maybe even architecture for the next 4 years or more. In a larger context, this debate is a reflection of the current issues of our time, conflicting desire, different agendas, merging tradition and of innovative ideas, where multivalence is the norm. This world of multiple notion of simultaneous environment, of instantaneous communication, of being at different places at the same time, is not something which is unfamiliar with Lise Anne Couture, our guest speaker this evening, and who will also be our visiting design professor this coming spring. In fact, it is what the practice of Asymptote, the office which Lise Anne established with Hani Rashid, has been seeking to construct since its inception in 1987. In its scientific definition, asymptote is a line which approaches nearer to some curve than assignable distance, but though infinitely extended, would never meet it. Asymptote, the office, uses this analogy to describe their belief and theoretical approach to the practice of architecture. They build a practice which responds to the complexity in architecture and which is not limited to a particular genre, but instead reaches out to a broader spectrum of work, ranging from office furniture for Knoll International, a virtual reality trading floor for the New York Stock Exchange, different working environment installation amongst building and large urban design project. The presentation of their works, from collage photographs to multimedia environments, embodies a kaleidoscopic approach which is not limited to the traditional bounds of architecture logic, but which embraces processes from digital technology and media, formal inspiration from product design, transportation system, communication network, organic structure, etc., etc., etc. In the exploration on the perspective of digital technology, They seek an architecture which would operate between the physical world and the electronic world, between what we think of real space and what we look at as virtual space. Asymptote became a pathfinder for many of us from the day when they won the competition Steel Cloud, a monument dedicated to immigration bridging the 101 freeway in downtown Los Angeles. And they have yet let us down in their experimentation for new architectural paradigms. Maybe Lise Anne tonight could give us the answer for finding a number between 0.999 and 1. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Lise Anne Couture.
Thank you, Ming, for the generous introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. I can't believe it's actually my first time in this building. I don't know what took you so long to invite me, but I'm very happy to be here, and I'm happy to be returning in January and to be teaching a studio. And I'd like to thank those of you who, I don't know if it's a toin cost or if, I think Florencia used TiVo as a verb. She said, I'm going to TiVo the debate. So many of you maybe are taping it and will watch it later. I could always do a lot of pointing with my thumb if that's going to fill the gap a little bit, or scowl. But thank you very much for being here tonight. I don't know if any of you read the newspaper today concerning a big tax bill that was passed yesterday to essentially assuage the World Trade Organization given tariff arguments between the United States and Europe, but they passed this huge bill aimed at manufacturers and corporations, and you may not know this, but now architecture is considered manufacturing, and for that the Republicans are going to give us a 9% tax cut. So I was thinking about this notion of manufacturing and architecture, and it was interesting to walk into this room and see this ceiling here, and it made me think that maybe that classification is perhaps more appropriate than one might think initially. So my talk tonight wasn't really derived from that article, but I am interested in how practice is changing given the tools that we have at our disposal, not just in terms of how we become more efficient, how we can become more accurate, how we can become more economical, but how the tools that we have had for the past 10 years are affecting the way we conceive of architecture, the way that we develop those ideas, the way we communicate them, the way we implement them, and finally fabricate and construct. And so I began by reflecting essentially on this notion of surfaces, because many of you know, obviously, working with computers in the school, and for those of you who are practitioners, that so much of the software today has to do with manipulation of surfaces, lines that become surfaces, and all of the points and different characteristics of surfaces that allow one to begin to generate architectural form, architectural spaces, and to begin to understand new ways of perhaps responding to programs, sites, and so on and so forth. And for us, we really started working with computers from outside of the practice, so to speak. We were working with graphic design programs, animation programs before Maya, largely because architectural programs were rather limiting, and we would rather use programs that were not intended for architecture as a means to sort of break the box. So these, just to sort of get us into gear here, here are some of the initial drawings that we were doing some time ago that are based on an observation that when Alias essentially came on the marketplace, what was curious about it was that it wasn't a program that was for architects, it was for designers, so to speak. When we were meeting with the president of Alias, he was very proud to show us how one of their main clients was Nike, and it just seemed rather strange that a software that was designed for designing running shoes would become an appropriate tool to making architecture. But then we also became aware of how this tool was used to make toothbrushes, to design razors, to design running shoes, to design automobiles, and also architecture. And the fact that the tool became so ubiquitous obviously was something that one should and could reflect upon. And it became, for us, rather interesting how the notion that the tool might have its own kinds of prejudices, its own leanings in terms of what could be generated, would begin to push and pull architecture in various directions. And of course, one could say that there is a similarity between a Schick razor and a Nike running shoe and a GM car. And for us, we decided to kind of dismantle some of the product that was coming out of using these tools and to make new assemblages that in a way were scaleless and could no longer be defined as building or object or space. And those became sort of meditations. And those kinds of sketches are often methods that we begin to work in a project. We essentially start from a very abstract basis. We almost, you could say, recycle work in the sense that we do theoretical work or work that's essentially done to be displayed in a museum or an art gallery, but as architects it always is embedded with essentially the DNA of space making and form making, and it always comes back to haunt us when we do more conventional architecture and building projects. And other forms of meditation essentially that we partake in are essentially full-scale installations. And this is a drawing just showing essentially a section cut through an installation that we did at the Venice Biennale in the year 2000. So it was a large inflatable pneumatic structure, and inside were two mirrors that rotate on a central axis. And this became essentially a meditation on a way to converge both the physical reality of being in one place and also the possibility of being connected virtually to a much wider audience and a much wider space, and to have some form of reciprocity so that the person on the virtual side could begin to interact some way with the real space. So here's just a kind of rendering of what the structure looked like, a series of sections that aren't too revealing. But on the interior, you can see here one of the mirrors, and there's a center cutout where Eyepicks camera, and Eyepicks cameras now can essentially create a spherical image. At this point in time, the Eyepicks cameras could record a 180-degree hemispherical space. So on each side of this structure, there's a mirror on each side, and there's an Eyepicks camera on each one, and each one is recording a hemispherical space. And these cameras are linked to the internet, so in real time, somebody can be manipulating the viewpoint of this camera so that you could be essentially scoping out and scanning in any number of trajectories through the space. While at the same time, anybody who comes into this space has to essentially manipulate these mirrors in order to move through the space, because the volume of space underneath is really the result of the carving out that's generated by the rotation of the mirrors. And I'll give you an example of what happens with that in a moment. But you can see already in this slide how this part of the image almost looks like a photo collage. And we're very interested in this quality of surfaces to kind of be not as they seem, to essentially have a kind of multi-dimensionality about them. And obviously glass is, that aspect of glass has been something that's carried forth with us since the early modern period with Mises towers, for instance, and so on and so forth. But the advent of technology allows us to augment that to a whole other degree. So I can't show you essentially what somebody was seeing on the internet, but you could imagine that somebody's in the space manipulating this at the same time that somebody's on the web in real time and navigating within that space in their own set of trajectories. And what the net result was, no pun intended, was that the internet was recording essentially a still frame every 5 seconds. So that at the end of the series, at the end of the exhibition, on the internet were 1.2 million still frames of every almost possible spatial configuration that could take place within this installation as a record. So you can see here this notion of the space being conflated. You can't tell if the person is behind the mirror, in front of the mirror. And so inhabitants within the same space, you have to question when you see another figure, are they behind the mirror in front of you, or are you seeing the reflection of somebody behind you? And again, this notion of how the interior and the exterior become conflated within the center of the space, and the constant kind of movement and deformation that takes place. So this notion of conflation, of blurring the boundaries between interior and exterior, and allowing a kind of body and space to experience that, is something that also is interesting to us. And these kinds of installations are ways for us to think about those possibilities, and they kind of hopefully will come back in projects, in commissions in the future, we hope, and looked at a kind of other scale. Another example is this installation that we did in San Francisco about 3 or 4 years ago, I think around the same time as the Venice project. We were artists in residence at the CCA, and we made this large structure, well, large model, small building. It was essentially the size of 2 cars on end. It's hard to describe scale-wise. But the idea was that one might speculate that you could have surfaces that could react to stimuli, environmental stimuli, or that could somehow react to the presence or the proximity of a body, that it could be an intelligent surface, an intelligent architecture. So what you're seeing here is essentially one side of the structure. It's something that's in the round. You're not really looking at a flat projection. The figure in the video looks like there's pressing buttons, but they're actually just virtual objects on the surface. And this also became a way for us to just to experiment technically. We've been fortunate to do some fairly interesting museum installations with the Guggenheim as essentially exhibition architects, and we're always looking at new ways to accommodate media art. And how can the architecture be more than just a kind of blank canvas? How can we use the actual architecture to become augmented by the video, or vice versa, that somehow the architecture can contribute to the work of art, and we can work collaboratively with some of the artists in the show. And that happened last year when we worked for the Guggenheim and did a moving pictures exhibition design at the Bilbao, and we collaborated with 2 artists in terms of how we manipulated the space for their work to be incorporated. Other kind of investigations with our obsession with surface and form has taken us to the realm of the automotive. And this drawing is essentially one of a series of drawings that was looking at the forms generated by automobile design, and sort of again kind of modeled, collaged. I mean, we're always also kind of borrowing from past techniques and then incorporating new technology and making new forms of kind of representation. So here there's again, this started out as essentially a photo collage, and then it was modeled, then it was animated, and so on and so forth. And we're interested again still here meditating on how might architecture be informed by, at the very least, if not fully incorporating some of the technology that's available in mass production, and car industry being a kind of great example of the potential of that. We then did another installation at Documenta 11 in Kassel. We were one of 3 architects that were invited, and that one piece that you saw was essentially transformed. It was started off as this sort of contorted, transformed car body. Then it became literally, in our minds, a kind of vehicle that would move through the city and collect information. And at the Documenta installation, it sort of had another life. It became transformed once again. It became a vehicle, but it recorded essentially aspects of notations of the city. And what we did, in fact, here you can sort of see one view of the installation. This was the initial room that you walked into, and it was a combination of video projection perfectly matched onto an object, which was again a kind of further development of the project from the CCAC. And the content that we used for it was looking at various cityscapes around the world. So we chose just to kind of narrow it down, Hong Kong, Tokyo, and New York. And we looked at essentially the skylines or the waterfront elevation of those cities as kind of iconographic images of those cities. But if you squint, what becomes interesting is how, in the end, they're not so distinct. We had spent some time in China that year, and it really was quite an important trip in terms of how much impact it made on us as we, were awestruck with how much development is going on, how quickly it's happening, and how banal it is. At the same time, of course, just incredibly inspired and taken by the diversity of the culture and the inspiration that can be found there, and how does one reconcile this notion of globalization and also this notion of cultural difference simultaneously. So this piece, in the end, became this kind of melding of a very broad range of interests. So as you walk into the first room, on the floor there's a projection, and you sort of see in a flattened way how a simulation essentially of what takes place. So you can sort of see this vehicle, it's texture mapped with this image taken from, I think this must be New York, onto its surface. And it's almost like a printing press. It's like it's kind of either it's picking up a surface or it's generating it by its rotational movement. And then when you go in the next room, just by using two of these large forms and surrounding the space with mirrors at essentially eye level or higher, one has a sense that the whole space has been filled out with this this new form, and again the texture map is video projected onto it and perfectly matched. So we work in the computer simulating exactly what we're going to do, and we derive the perfect kind of outline or mask for the texture map, video texture map, and then we project it back onto the object that's derived at first as a virtual object, becomes a real object, and we did a real video into the virtual object and then back out into the real space. And this kind of moving back and forth between virtual and real for us is also something that's of great interest. So this is just a still showing you the kind of effect as you first walked into this space. And this was the first year that they used this new exhibition hall in Kassel, and we were the first room. So people came in and they didn't know how big the new building was, and they thought that we had taken over essentially thousands and thousands of square feet with our installation. So it was quite a success in that realm. And then once you begin to stand there for a few minutes and you see each one of the cities kind of fade in and fade out, you become aware, firstly, of, you don't become aware that they're different. It takes a little while to recognize the fact that the first, the second, and there's three that are being displayed. And it takes a while for you to even understand that the soundtrack is different. So here you can sort of see that there's this repetitious notion almost of the kind of global, international style kind of gone crazy, being rolled out, so to speak, again like printing presses, generating these cities all over the world. And what's interesting is when you're standing there and the space is, fairly quiet except for the soundtrack, you become aware of how the kind of musicality of each city becomes the key to understanding which culture you're partaking in. So you don't even hear the words that people are speaking, but you can understand the kind of sing-song as one culture and the kind of gruffness is the American culture standing at the water cooler at the elevator. So here you kind of get a close-up view of that installation. Now, having done all that kind of work, we were very interested to take part in the I-Beam competition. I think Diller Scafidio won that competition, and we were shortlisted in the initial round. And this became a chance for us to posit how might some of the types of work that we are doing experimentally might inform how one thinks of an art museum, a museum that's really specializing, let's say, in digital art for the 21st century be thought of. And there were a number of issues besides just the kind of museum program that had to be considered. One was just its siting. And so what this drawing shows in a way is not just kind of interwoven program as its heading suggests, but beyond that, really looking at the program of the museum and the program of the city. And it was cited for this kind of mid-block site in Chelsea, Manhattan. And we were really interested in thinking about how a museum space could actually spill out onto the street and how the space of the city could be sucked inside, and how we might have a kind of much more dynamic relationship between the two, depending on how you kind of think about the surfaces that begin to define that building envelope. So these, again, are some of the kinds of sketches that we were doing initially in this project. They're, again, a kind of combination back and forth between modeling and collage, Photoshop, back and forth, looking at various ideas. This is just two of many that were generated. And again, they're starting to lean towards an attitude about structure, about section, about skin. And then we became pragmatic, and we looked at each end of the site essentially had different condition. And so we responded to each end and thought, well, what if we just kind of extrapolate between the two? So what this image is showing you is the kind of result of all of those midsections combined, one on top of each other, but one section is on the east and one section's on the west. And this began to suggest a very kind of specific treatment of the floor slabs that would join essentially the east and west party walls. And so we worked very carefully with Buro Happold in determining how we might use that notion to create a kind of structural surface, so to speak, positing that there would be areas of redundancy structurally that could then be carved away, and that would begin to afford another kind of transparency, another kind of porosity between the city and the space of the museum. And then, of course, the notion that you enclose the whole thing with glass, and we love that idea of just taking plastic wrap and kind of pulling it over an irregularly shaped object, and then again you kind of create these residual spaces that have yet to be kind of, belonging to a specific program. They could become kind of special areas within the museum that kind of seep in and out of the other kind of undulating surface. So then these become in a very kind of preliminary fashion at this point. This becomes a kind of assembly from which we develop the project further. And these sections begin to show you how those initial extrapolations between the two party walls begin to register sectionally. And this posits two things. It allows us to think very fluidly about the circulation, which was important because there were three main programmatic areas. One had to do with performance space, one had to do with exhibition space, and one had to do with essentially education or atelier artist kind of workshop space. And the idea behind the brief was that really these spaces could be shared, these spaces could fluctuate, these spaces could overlap. And so how do you actually kind of turn those words into actuality was for us the challenge. And we also just reflected upon the notion of digital art and what is digital art and what is its provenance. And I think that we're at an interesting time in the discipline of architecture as well as in the discipline of art or visual arts. One could say, for instance, that video art is essentially the derivative of photography. Others would say, no, video art comes from performance, which comes from sculpture. In the end, we don't really care. What we're really interested in is that it's hard to pin down. We're interested in the fact that it does overlap. We're interested in the fact that sculptors work with video and computers, and that painters use computers, and that these kinds of disciplines actually are becoming almost archaic in terms of their old definitions. So we kind of transformed that observation into a strategy for how to deal with program. This is essentially a number of still frames taken out of an animation that shows how the building transforms. In the center here, you sort of see the performance space, because we thought performance shouldn't be relegated to the basement. It shouldn't be relegated to some other wing. It should really almost be central. And then down here is at grade level, and below grade level is the exhibition space per se, and the education spaces are above, and there's room for expansion above. But what really happens is that aspects of the building can be slid away, and stairs can be lowered and ramps can be lowered, such that all of these areas can begin to migrate up and down, so that you really can literally have a physical transformation of space as well as a programmatic one. And what I mean by that, well, here just to backtrack, is you see on the street level how that sloping floor that you saw in the section becomes a way, for instance, for the exhibition space to occupy essentially 2 ground floor levels. The basement level is cut open to such a great degree that it really isn't below level. And you can sort of see how the facade is tilted up and really begins to allow the space of the museum to spill out onto the street. But here again is that notion of program, because you see this stair coming down from the performance space. It's essentially a floor that can be activated and become almost like stadium seating. It can become a grand stair. It can become the place for a lecture to take place, for an educational program. It can become seating for a performance. It can become a grand access for a kind of exhibition space. So we can no longer really define any of these spaces as being kind of uni-programmatic in a sense. And what you also saw in this is I would be standing along the window here, and I'm at the point where the floor is halfway below sidewalk level, and you can see how it opens up to the lower level. So the whole notion even of what is grade becomes called into question. And the scale of these large displays are very deliberate. They're borrowed essentially from the scale of billboards that are placed on buildings in Manhattan. And it's a way for this space to almost become larger than life at night, so that walking by this space, or even more importantly, driving by this space, it really is in your face, and it really kind of operates at an urban scale. As here's another kind of example of that stair in a physical model. But what's also perhaps important to note is this box that's kind of moving between the 2 floors is actually the freight elevator. So the big rider trucks would come through these glass facade here, and this elevator could be lifted up to be loaded and bring equipment up to the performance space. When it's not used as a freight elevator, the top of it can become a place for the display of art, or for a place of performance again, or for academic lectures, or so on and so forth. And on the lower level, it can be used as display case, as a vitrine, as a video room, and so on and so forth. We were very intrigued with the notion of doing what we call the video pool. We'd like to be commissioned to do a piece in there. And so, you know, we're trying to think about ways that artists might like to exhibit without kind of tying them to extremely kind of idiosyncratic conditions. So we're trying to find the balance between the white box, but also offering provocative situations that could inspire people that are interested in thinking about new ways to present work or to interact with an environment. And you can see back here that kind of video vitrine. In this image of the physical model, you can see how the stair goes up to the performance space, and the retractable walls have been moved so that this space is contiguous now with the education space above, so that the exhibition continues, so to speak, because the workshops can become open to the public, and the work that's on display or in production is something that the public can partake in, and also the students that are there, or the artists that are in residence, can feel like they are really kind of part of the life of the museum itself. Now the floor is closed, and it's been superimposed with another kind of display. It could either be something static, or again, it could be kind of a video surface. And here you sort of see again this floor that's folding down. It looks a little steeper than it would actually be. But you get the idea that somehow this is really kind of, you know, playing the game between being essentially a museum lobby and almost like a storefront at a very, very large scale that's participating in the life of the street. And then up here you sort of see the closed floor and the possibility of actually whatever's occurring in this floor display now being essentially mounted on either side or being transparent. So this notion of surfaces, you know, continues to haunt us in other projects, and I'm just going to show you 2 very small projects, or more simple, or let's say maybe less complex. This is a very simple office building, actually, for the World Trade Organization, the ones that are responsible for our 9% tax cut. And it's located in Geneva, and it's essentially at the annex to the headquarters there. And they ran out of space to have some of their office space, and also they have hearing rooms that are open to the public for some of these fairly important judicial sessions that take place between countries that are in dispute. And it's a very strange site. Essentially, you're standing on a bridge overlooking the rail yards. The train station is not very far off to the left. And so this is the side elevation of the building. The front entrance actually is right over here. And you would enter off this street, but this really becomes a predominant facade that one would experience in the city. And adjacent to it are just warehouses and so on that are serviced by the trains along here, and trucking that connects to the train system. And so with a kind of very stringent program and a very low budget, we essentially just kind of made a very simple box, but then took advantage of essentially a strategy for environmental control, working with some engineers to use the double envelope as a way to essentially bring some life to this building. And we use the rail yards essentially as a way to to map onto the surface and to generate three-dimensionally an articulated facade. So you can sort of see here how the manipulation or the transformation of those rail lines reflected up onto the building and then essentially manipulated three-dimensionally. And why it works so well is because the double facade is essentially normal or normative on the interior, so it works very efficiently when you need to push furniture against it. You still have 90-degree corners in all of the rooms, but the airspace doesn't have to be regular. The airspace can be varied. So working kind of very economically with shallow manipulations of the surface, we can kind of create the effect of almost three-dimensional curvature. The eye is almost tricked by virtue of the nature of the lines here, but in fact all the panels of glass are flat. And then on the inside, we essentially created a donut-shaped building, and on the inside is essentially another building. So there's essentially a U-shaped office building with an atrium, and on the inside is this little tower. And the reason for that, and was rather clever, we thought on our part, is that the WTO, as the World Trade Organization that you might know, is under a lot of fire recently because some people find that its policies aren't treating third world countries fairly and so on. So the security risk is very serious, but at the same time their mission is to be open to the public. So there had to be this ability to almost control very clearly the parts of the building that are open to the public. So essentially one can enter into this building within the building without ever having to cross the threshold into the other part. I think we have a kind of partiche sort of showing you that. And this is essentially the entrance that comes in, so you sort of see from the corner across the bridge. And then the glass folds under and is almost continuous with that tower, as though it almost turns inside out and becomes the little kind of tower of judicial chambers on the interior. And then this is another competition for the World Property Organization, another UNESCO organization located in Geneva. And the challenge here, we were shortlisted for this competition as well. This is the headquarters for the World Intellectual Property Organization. So they're responsible for trying to find a way to control copyright on software and intellectual property. And they obviously had to expand with the developments in the technology world in the 80s and 90s. And so they wanted a new building on this site, with the caveat that they had to physically be connected. And in reviewing the competition submission documents, we didn't win. Every competitor put a big pedestrian glass bridge across here, which was the first thing that we decided not to do. And the way we got around that was by using the landscape. And so essentially what we did is we joined the bottom floor at grade level and created a new entrance to both of the buildings. And the new entrance would also become essentially an exhibition space that could somehow make public whatever is occurring within the realm and the latest developments and the latest kinds of projects that are taking place. And more importantly is that it also becomes a new kind of landscape that shields the residential neighborhood on one side from essentially a fairly busy traffic street on the other, and becomes a quasi-park extension for the people that are working in the building. And so in this case, this notion of surface becomes actually a landscape that melds right into the building. And the building itself is fairly simple. It has a kind of high-tech facade that's double-skinned and has special shading for the various orientations and so on and so forth. And economically, what we decide to do is just essentially put our money where the public is. So when you look at it, you can essentially tell wherever there's a bulge is where there's essentially public space within the building. So here you sort of see that new entrance that's carved into the new hill. It provides a new plinth. So here you have an outdoor space for the office. It becomes a new park for the neighborhood, and then they can kind of walk over. There's a nice path that would be carved into that. And then you can see here, this is an earlier scheme because this wall becomes actually articulated as you go on, but this sort of gives you an idea of the nature of the interior space. I'll probably talk a little bit more about how one uses computer technology not just to generate curved forms, but how one can be intelligent about them in terms of regulating geometry and being able to understand what the implications are in terms of construction and in terms of cost. So we were kind of on a roll with office buildings for a while, and we felt like we understood them quite well because we had been working with Knoll for a couple of years. Knoll approached us about 4 years ago to rethink what the office environment of the 21st century might be, and still kind of relying on some form of office furniture, otherwise they wouldn't be in business. But they were really interested in how might one essentially create something that was an alternative to what they call the ice cube tray syndrome, and recognizing that there are new modes of working and people have different expectations about their workplace. I don't know why this guy is going backwards, but and new ideas about what constitutes an office environment. And this is probably most of you are familiar with this. This is the Chiat Day office environment done by Gaetano Pesce, and I guess it was in the mid-90s. And it was very interesting. It was the first time that somebody said, well, let's look at this notion of the virtual office, not in the sense of working from home, for instance, but might we have a collective place where everybody just has a laptop and there's a number of different environments, and depending on your mood and depending on the task that you're doing, you can go and inhabit any one of those, but nobody has their own space. And it was a big flop. And the reason for that is because people, I think, have a certain kind of work ethic, and they place some part of their identity on what they do, and that's represented by the space they occupy. It becomes territorial. It signifies their contribution. It signifies their worth. If they don't have a space, they feel like they don't have a kind of presence, and they're so there was a backlash against that. And so we had to sort of rethink what might be some of the possibilities. And going back to some of those kinds of sketches that I showed earlier, how do we sketch today maybe again? In this instance, we were looking for instance, at what might be the kind of space that the body could need, looking at ergonomics in a new light. And we were challenged by Knoll on many fronts. The reason they came to us, because the first thing we said is, we've never designed furniture, and they said, I know, that's great. Was they had seen some of the work that we did with the New York Stock Exchange, and that we were, in their minds, a firm that really understood how technology might be affecting not only how you integrate it spatially, but how does technology affect the way that we interact with each other? How does it affect the way that we work? And what might be the kind of trajectory or trend that we're part of now. So they were asked us to think about essentially, how might a 50,000 square foot space be considered today, and how does that kind of translate down to the individual unit? And I think they were interested in having us as architects work on this because that's really the way we think. We're always operating at the 40,000 foot altitude level at the same time working on the minuscule detail. And that's, I think a great skill of architects is the ability to have such an elastic mind in terms of being able to consider things from so many vantage points simultaneously. And so in this instance, we're looking at the scale of the human body. We're looking at how we might be thinking about surfaces given the way we could inhabit a kind of stationary position in the precinct that one describes as your personal space. And we also question, of course, the nature of existing furniture versus what might be the capabilities for manufacturing today. And much of what was on the market at the time, of course, was rectilinear and really the result of efficient modes of production, both in terms of design, pre-computer, and in terms of manufacturing. Flat plate steel that's cut and just welded together. And so here we start looking again at how we might expand that notion of the space of the individual into the space of the collective. And some, this is just one of many, many different interpretations. And then another kind of sketch, it's just really kind of an ideogram about how might we cluster things and how might they be able to transform given different situations, different requirements by different companies or different individuals. And so this resulted in this first prototype that was presented to Knoll in Denver, Colorado, about 3 years ago, and it actually went into production soon after that. And I guess you could say that it was fairly radical for salespeople anyways. And there were a number of things that were apparent already in the prototype phase. One was we were rethinking the kinds of pieces that normally are associated with a workspace, usually have a kind of overhead cabinet that's designed for binders. And we were much more interested in the kind of overhead cabinet you have on an airplane. And we like the fact that, today you have so many interesting, you have a lot of interesting equipment in sports and in camping gear and so on and so forth. And can't we learn from that if we're trying to be light, if we're trying to be more environmentally friendly in terms of using less material, if we're trying to make things easy to mount and to change. So we looked at tent technology, and we thought a lot about the nature of materiality and so on and so forth. And so this was the end result. This is a single unit, and it's obviously all made in components, so you could have any number of these rearranged into different ways to be more or less complete. But a number of the kind of issues that we were grappling with are made apparent here. One is just the notion of materiality and transparency, and how does a body inhabit space, and how might we think differently about surfaces. So one has to do with the geometry, obviously. So that's partially dealing with a kind of notion of comfort that one has when one's inside sitting in here. Another just has to do with the possibilities technologically with how we generate these forms. We don't have to just draw straight angles to be efficient in generating the designs, because we can be as efficient using more sophisticated software that can provide other kinds of geometries. And we don't have to rely as a result on flat plate steel being welded and making boxes. We can think about injection molding and other forms of manufacturing that could be made very cost effectively and could lend itself to a very streamlined design process. So here again is another rendition of that. And obviously this notion of transparency was very important to us, and we were interested in how there was this kind of dual need. And I think because we're architects, we were very aware of the kind of sensibilities people have in space collectively. On the one hand, people want to have their own territory. On the other hand, they want to have privacy. On the other hand, they don't want to feel like they're alone. And so how do you begin to deal with all of these conflicting demands? So for us, it was about thinking about state of mind and how people can become focused on a task such that even if something adjacent to you is semi-transparent, your state of mind, allows you to kind of focus, and you're not so aware of what's happening to you around you in the periphery. At the same time, you can have the ability, whenever you're out of that frame of mind, to glance around and become aware of the environment that you're in, so you don't feel like, they call it the Dilbert effect. If people sit down and suddenly they can't see anything but the horizon line, is like, hello, anybody there? So you can become aware of being part of a collective and hopefully feeling like a fruitful collaborator and contributor to that collective. The notion that these parts have deliberate gaps as a mode of connection, but also again becomes a way for visual communication through. So we're trying to kind of walk that fine line between providing collective space and privacy at the same time. And the geometry also was something that we were interested in to kind of break the monotony of the horizon line in large-scale environments so that you could have essentially a landscape occurring. And of course, you know, beginning to suggest new colors as well as new materials, and to think about the office place as being able to be more lively than it had been in the past. And this isn't, you know, we're not trying to sell this to every kind of corporation, but there is a segment of the market that is, you know, really kind of dissatisfied with what was available and was looking for something new. And this is just one kind of example of how you might cluster these. Again, you don't have to use the whole thing. You could use just segments and parts. But it began to suggest that you could easily dismount, change, and remount configurations for different kinds of working situations, given that so many organizations are constantly shifting their teams and the tasks at hand, and projects as they evolve need new kinds of organizations to respond to. So that notion of flexibility was very important. So this gives you, like, this is a kind of interpretation, almost like the ice cube tray made out of our A3 project, and this is a kind of another arrangement, almost arabesque-like, another kind of geometric planning arrangement, another one that would be, you know, speaks to different kinds of organizational needs. Again, here the notion of the landscape. But probably what would happen is that every different area within an organization would need its own kind of tailored arrangement, so that if it was, for instance, you know, telemarketers, they might want kind of individual stalls. If it was a creative team, they might want a much more open environment to collaborate, and so on and so forth. And so along with developing new geometries to rethink the components so that this is more like an overhead, people don't just have, you know, binders in these things. They have their motorcycle helmets, their roller blades, their gym bag, their shopping, their laundry. You know, it's kind of a reflection also on contemporary life and how people inhabit the workplace. We're also interested in looking at new materials. So this is injection molded plastic, and this is essentially milled MDF that can have divots and different kinds of landscapes in the surface. And then along all of these places where you kind of have a tactile relationship with, where you have your hand touches or your wrist rests and so on, is a soft material that we developed with a manufacturer that's very much like the soft part of your toothbrush or your razor, except for they never made a kind of toothbrush part this big before, so it was rather interesting, some of the experiments that came out of that. And the notion of customization, so that you could essentially ask them to do a very custom pattern. We could digitize and digitally print anything on these fabrics. Again, just kind of showing you the flexibility, different kinds of arrangements, different thinking about how you organize the desktop. One thing you'll notice is that there aren't very many cables, because we firmly believed that they were going to go away someday. Nobody believed us, but it's becoming a reality. You all know that. And then, you know, all of that flexibility essentially comes from a kit of about 20 parts. And I think what surprised the engineers when we were working with them is that as architects, there's no bad side to something. You know, even the roof is something that one considers when you have tall buildings around. The back shouldn't just be a back, or the side shouldn't just be a side, and the inside edge should be beautiful if you're going to pull your drawer out and it's going to be open most of the time. So we really almost treated every component like a small piece of architecture. And then hopefully that would bring a kind of, you know, new spirit to the workplace. Just showing you some of the arrangements in space. This next project I'm going to show you, this is a client. His name is Carlos Miele. He's an artist and a fashion designer. And I think that our work with him was almost collaborative. He was such a good client. But he's interesting because he's Brazilian, and he's interested in two things. He's interested, obviously, in elegant women's clothing, but he's interested in the potential of high technology. He works with DuPont, developing all sorts of new materials, combining high-tech fibers with leather, for instance, and so on and so forth, changing the characteristics of materials that are very familiar to us, and using laser cutting, for instance, to make very delicate fabrics that are almost lace-like. And he's very interested in traditional crafts and how to incorporate handiwork from traditional Brazilian crafts. And I think that there was a good fit because he really was interested in us pushing technology and how might that kind of become a reflection on the nature of his fashion. And he wasn't interested in a store just to kind of, you know, have a great kind of sales record, but really something that would speak spatially and experientially about the kind of idea and philosophy of his fashion. So this essentially became the point, or the concept about which we developed the scheme. It had to do with the notion of an altar. He's very interested in kind of various forms of spiritual practices in Brazil, and the notion of the altar, and we were very interested in how that might be translated at an architectural scale to be this kind of multifaceted, functional, programmatic element that functions for display, it's seating, it's theater, it's structure, it's all of those things, and of course it would become a sculpture of sorts that we could begin to experiment with in terms of fabrication and production as well. So this it's not the final scheme, unfortunately, but you can see this was just a very kind of straightforward storefront space in New York. The centerpiece changed quite a bit, and you'll see in the final slides, but what you can see is there's a column here, there's a column here, column here, column here, column here. And when you see the final space, you can't tell at all that there was any kind of structure in the space. It feels like it's a wide open space with just this kind of liquid-like interior. And this notion of liquidity, again, goes back to how we might think about surfaces today, and not only how we experience them, but how we deal with them when we're conceiving of them and we're considering how to render them in reality. So this interior view, this is a kind of foregrounded by this altar piece. This notion of liquidity and lightness and fluidity extends all the way to how we decided to hang the dresses. As you can see, there's no, well, it's hard to see in this slide, but you'll see in the others, there's no lighting fixtures in the ceiling. And so there's a couple of places, one right above where the dress is hanging, and then this ring in the floor. So you almost feel like things are held up by light. The floor and the ceiling are extremely shiny, so you feel like the space is almost infinite. Again, that kind of notion of materiality and virtuality coming together. Thinking back to that Venice project I showed you, how do we take some of those ideas without being so self-conscious, but they're always there, kind of inspiring us in some way, and they come out in sometimes in ways that you wouldn't expect. Here again, you sort of see these dresses seemingly just kind of being anti-gravitational and floating in the space. Again, you can sort of see this altar here, and the way it kind of functions as a display. It becomes theater. We're really interested not in the kind of cynical approach a la Oma, you know, about shopping and so on. You know, shopping is spectacle, and shopping is a kind of social activity, and it's interesting to see how people come in this store and they kind of linger, and there's a kind of voyeuristic activity that takes place. We also did a video piece in this niche here. You can't really see what's going on, but there's a kind of interesting effect that takes place, this concave mirror. This gives you another view. And so this became another project that we experimented with in terms of how do you go, like with Knoll. I didn't get into it too much with Knoll, but you know, how do you go from having an idea to developing those in the computer. How do you then kind of very seamlessly generate the working drawings and the production drawings? How do those get translated to a fabricator and ultimately fabricated and assembled? And I think that what's really been interesting for us in the opportunities that we've had is that there's been very little compromise, and that you can maintain a remarkable level of control. And as much as this might appear as a kind of unique architectural setting and look very expensive, in fact it wasn't. Just because we can be in control of and work collaboratively with the fabricators to generate a method of assembly that makes sense, and also be able to kind of manipulate it at a very fine level geometrically so that you can essentially tweak certain areas that become less than cost effective, and so on and so forth. And lastly, I'd like to say about this store, going back to the I-beam project, is that we really wanted something playing on this notion of theater and spectacle that would participate in the life of the street. So we convinced our client not to get one of those big pull-down gates. It's lit up all night, very dramatically, and it really becomes part of the city environment. I don't have a night shot, but you can sort of see in this one here how it just, the space of the street and the space of the store really kind of come together and fuse. And I love the way the reflections of the city on the glass, it's almost as though there's, again, a kind of confluence or convergence of those. Going back again to these sketches, which were with the automobile body and manipulating those, we were invited on 2 occasions to, now we're on our 3rd actually, project currently in the office, to work on certain car-related projects. And on this project, Florencia Pita was one of the project architects, and she was instrumental in contributing to the design of this project. This is for the BMW Event and Delivery Center. It essentially is a place where you have a quasi-theme park where they display all sorts of new technologies and so on and so forth related to the car, blue screen, you can do simulated races and so on. But it's also a place where people from abroad come to pick up their car that they've ordered, and they have all kinds of deals with free airplane tickets and so on. But the real reason behind it, and they actually put this in print, is to bond with the brand for life. So you come to essentially witness the birth of your car. And the whole scheme here is built around the delivery of the cars coming from the factory underground, and essentially all of the plans reflect a kind of circuit of the cars and people traveling through the building. So on one side, if I just go back quickly, on one side of the building is essentially where the public, general public can go, and on the other side of the building is where invited guests who are picking up their cars, and kind of by invitation only, event space where they hand over your car and they have a ceremony and all sorts of events take place. And we were, this shows you the BMW, the Event and Delivery Center, and adjacent over here is the BMW headquarters, and the factory is just behind here. And this section through shows you the place where the invitation-only section, and this is the general public section. And what's important also to note is it's adjacent to the Munich Olympic site, so there's actually a passageway around and through the building, so that even people that are going from essentially the street to the Olympic Park, which is still a park as well as housing, can partake in the experience of the BMW brand. We were inspired very much by the Fiat building in Turin, where they have this test track on the roof, and we thought, well, what would be, and it's a very rationalist building built in the 1920s or 30s, and we thought, well, what would be essentially a late 20th, early 21st century correlation to that? And so essentially this building is generated by the movement of the car traveling through its interior. And so what actually happens is that the person that gets their car delivered picks it up in this side over here, and after going through all of the ceremonies, essentially takes a victory lap through the entire building and becomes one of the displays essentially for the people that are in the public sector. So here you can sort of see that one of the spaces, and then this is where the person that's gotten their new car becomes essentially part of the display and essentially drives right out the building. We didn't win. And something else about the, I showed you that red sketch. We were very much interested in not only allowing the car to carve the form of the building, but to really think again about how we might make this building, how might we generate the geometries, how might we think about assembling it and the details and so on. And we were, of course, inspired by some of the details in car design, the wheels, the lights, and so on and so forth. So when we were thinking about skylights and so on, it very much became like the building is also kind of branded much like the automobile on the exterior, carries with it some of that aesthetic. Now, since we didn't win that competition, we got in a Mercedes and went over to Stuttgart and did a competition for them. And the difference with the Mercedes project is it wasn't about a kind of moving vehicle anymore. The Mercedes project was really about a museum for the history of the automobile. We all think here in this country that, the automobile was invented by Ford, but over there it was invented by Mercedes. You may not know that. And so we thought, well, how can we deal with this notion of the dynamic object in a static position? And if you notice, in advertisements, they always show the car on an angle. The roads are straight, but somehow they always show, to give you this notion of movement, the car is always kind of placed on a non-orthogonal position. So we used that idea to think about creating a surface that was not orthogonal or horizontal, and that could begin to suggest the kinetic aspect of the vehicle. And so we generated essentially a kind of notion of the landscape that would become the interior of the museum, and a very kind of Kunsthal-like space, and believe it or not, inspired by Mies van der Rohe's National Gallery. And also looking again at the aesthetic of the automobile. This is an old, some of the cars were amazing that were in the existing museum. This is an old speed trial car. And so to generate that, we had to do some various serious studies of the kinds of topographies that would actually be feasible. So these are just some of the studies in plan showing the contour diagrams that were being generated, trying to determine appropriate slope, period, and so on and so forth. What kind of sectional condition could we tolerate? We actually did a lot of studies looking at circulation patterns. So there's a kind of shortcut path, and then there's the wheelchair accessible path. Believe it or not, it's actually working. These were all generated through a number of studies looking at different things, everything from the period and the kind of repetitive notion of the sine curve to something that might be more irregular, and the kinds of sectional conditions that could be generated above and below the slab. How might we deal with connecting above and below this kind of landscape? Different ways of cutting it. In the end, we generated essentially a double system, one for the roof and one for the floor. And we had a repetitive pattern because that became a way to reuse the formwork. So even though it looks, again, like a very expensive proposition, when you realize that you're essentially using the same fragment of a sphere over and over again, and then you incorporate that curvature into the structural system as a kind of arch, it becomes very effective. And then likewise, trying to incorporate other things within the structure to support the envelope and the roof above. We have this kind of superstructure, which also incorporates all of the HVAC system so that we can avoid having any kind of ducts within the envelope, and then a very kind of flexible skin just being hung on the outside that's like a louver system. In some places that allows a calibration of transparency and daylight so that you could have non-museum spaces facing onto a public space but with limited visibility from the outside to the inside. So this gives you an idea of the kind of structure of the roof and the large-scale columns. And these columns were scaled enough so that we only needed 6 of them in the entire space. And this gives you an idea of what the space would be like on the inside with these kinds of holes connecting to below, and at the far end of the space there's actually a ramp that goes down that is displaying the races and records display, where it's essentially almost like a race taking place with all the cars distributed as though they're in a race format. And essentially an open plan so that curators could be constantly repositioning and grouping the cars in various ways. And that just gives you an idea of how that space would look. This is a project that we actually built. We won this competition. It's for a pavilion in the Netherlands. It was the competition was held for a pavilion for this city. Well, it's Amsterdam actually, and it's a municipality that's located on the outskirts of Greater Amsterdam. And it was for the occasion of this, every 10 years they have a huge horticultural festival. And so this isn't to exhibit plants or anything, but it's the municipality that allows the city to showcase itself. So it was very important that it would be kind of an outstanding architectural piece. It's adjacent, it's right positioned on a kind of artificial lake. You have to cross a highway to get there. Essentially the gardens and parks cross the highway and continue all the way around this lake. So all these different countries made gardens all the way around this lake. And interestingly enough, it's also almost immediately adjacent to Schiphol Airport. So you have this very kind of pastoral, artificial landscape around you, and then these giant jumbo 747s flying overhead at very low altitude. So it's a very interesting mix, and for us this kind of notion of the proximity of the water and the organic and then these big airplanes flying overneath above you inspired us to kind of look at this notion of the deformed wing as a kind of starting point. And the wing was deformed to create two conditions, an interior volume for inhabitation and then this kind of exterior pocket. And the reason for the exterior pocket, and this just gives you kind of shows you how that wing deforms along every section as you move along it. And the reason for the pocket is that we wanted to incorporate water into our scheme. This municipality was celebrating its 150th anniversary for reclaiming the land. It had previously obviously been part of the sea, and so when they built these huge pumps in the 19th century, they reclaimed the land. And so our project paid homage to that. We located the project exactly on the edge between land and the fake lake, or artificial lake. We split the building at that point. And then we ran water down from the edge of both sides of the roof towards this split. The split is where you actually kind of enter the building proper. This side functions as a canopy and a place for outdoor kind of performances, gatherings, and also for people to wait in line when during the exhibition was on, and there'd be big lineups to get in. And you walk in, you don't just walk on this threshold, you actually walk on water because it's essentially a grill that's just suspended above the water, and you walk in between two water walls where the water's flowing down from each roof. And the original sea level is 0, which is a 5-meter difference, and so we placed the interior mezzanine at +5 or 0, which is recalling sea level, and again the water collects in this pocket at the same level. So it became a way to kind of pay homage to this original condition and reminds you about the history of the site. So this is kind of a working drawing or initial drawing showing you the section of the pool, the wing shape being broken in the two, and then this kind of mezzanine and exhibition space on the interior. And then we tried, we weren't quite sure how we would incorporate the water early on, and we thought very much about, incorporating seaming of material, structure, water distribution. Could we begin to bring all of these together? Again, a kind of original idea of trying to make this a structural surface, this roof. We're thinking about transparency very early on, but realized that actually we like the quality of the metal much more, and using transparency only in certain locations. So this is a kind of very early sketch just showing this, and this is showing you again this is the land is kind of curving along here, and we place the entrance on this water trough with this grill, and then the water's turned off because this is in construction. But you sort of see this glass walls aren't operational yet, but you would be walking between these two walls, snaking from one side to the other. This is the pool that when you're approaching, go down these steps, you walk underneath the pool, the water's collected at that level, then the water walls with the logo of the town painted on it. And then from the other side, you see again these water walls, people coming around the corner And this is how they appear sort of in between those two spaces, almost kind of ghost-like. And what's really interesting is you get so used when you're walking through that narrow space of seeing everything blurry through either side that when you finally come around the corner and you look at the lake and you look at the landscape, which is the idea is to kind of almost like blind you momentarily, so to speak, so that you become hyper-aware of the landscape. It becomes extremely crisp when you come around the corner and you can sort of see the view again. I don't know why that slide's there. It shouldn't be there. And then this is a kind of aperture into the opening. And it's important to note that there's another window above there. And I don't know if I don't have the right slide. I just want to go back for a moment to talk a little bit about that window. It looks crooked in this slide. But at this opening where there's this kind of fusing of this volume back into being part of the surface of the roof, water runs down on this. And what's interesting is, on the one hand, you're standing down here, you're under the water, and again, kind of going back to sea level, and you're inhabiting, you know, the Netherlands, which is all below sea level. So you're looking under the water at the sky, at these big 747s going by. But then the sun reflects through the window and puts the reflection of the water back down on the ground here. So then you end up literally walking on water, which you are because this is a pier, and you end up really being in the water. And it's really quite an amazing effect, and I wish I had the slide that kind of showed the two conditions happening simultaneously. And then again, this notion of theater for us, of public space and the exterior kind of coming together. And again, kind of taking the kind of picture window and really kind of throwing you out into the view when you go up to that sea level balcony on the inside. This again is taken during construction. You see the ladder. So in this scheme, we worked, you know, again, very kind of diligently with the computer all the way through all the various stages. And it was interesting that the panels for the building actually are the wireframe of the model. So we essentially mapped the elevation into a working drawing so that the panels aren't regularly spaced. They're following the flattened version of the wireframe. And we could essentially notate every panel that was two-dimensional curve, one-dimensional curve, three-dimensional. Well, not one. They call it 2.5. If you want to know what 2.5 curved is, I'll tell you later. And 3D curves. And so we could essentially be manipulating the geometry of the building until we had the right quota of expensive 3D curved panels, medium price 2.5D curved panels, lower priced, you know, one direction curved panels, and very cheap flat panels. And we could just be tweaking the three-dimensional model and essentially mapping out all of these panels to get the building envelope within a kind of budget target. And this was a very kind of fast-track project, so we were working directly with the panel manufacturers who were part of the aerospace industry. And so it was very interesting, and they were very excited to work with us. And then in terms of the glass, to be economical, we actually cold bent the glass on site. So you have these big, essential compression rings, and you determine the geometry beforehand with a template, and then you just tighten the steel until finally the glass conforms to the predetermined geometry. Here you get, again, a view of that window, and you can imagine if the sun was in the right direction, you would be able to see the reflection of the water down here and above you simultaneously. And that's the view of it kind of jutting out into this lake. I'm going to just quickly go through two very fast projects. Somebody who saw the HydroPure project commissioned us to do another project, and they almost wanted the same thing. And we said, no, 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 we can't do that. And this is a very different program, however. But this patron essentially came to us, and he's fairly old, and he said, you know, the HydroPure, when I'm in that space looking at the landscape, I want that kind of space to be the type of space that my family is in when it comes time for me to have my funeral. I thought, oh, okay. And so he approached the municipality and convinced them to consider building a new crematorium. And I know it sounds like, ooh, crematorium. But it's actually a really amazing program. I mean, the sort of what one thinks of, you know, 6 feet under, or whatever you guys think about those programs. But, you know, the kind of what we refer to as the technical facilities are located just in this area. And the rest of the building is really all public space for the most part. And the site is on the existing, there's essentially, burial grounds over here, and then places for cremated remains to be put in various kinds of niches and so on. And then this is a public park. This is essentially various kind of waterways and water retention devices. And so this project would begin to bridge over this little canal and become part of the public park. And there's no way to actually cross from here to here, but it borrows on the land and overlooks it. And so to just clarify what I meant about, public spaces, here's the kind of back of house stuff, essentially. And then within the pochette of the walls, these thick, if you can imagine, I colored all these orange, you'd see these kind of big, thick, almost like pochette spaces are all the service spaces, so to speak. And what happens is the public comes from this side, and they essentially flow through various rooms until they kind of come to the end over here. So this notion of the architecture as fluid is really kind of important to the way the project actually performs. People get dropped off here and the family comes in on one side, and then the friends and acquaintances come in on the other side. And this is all glass underneath a kind of canopy. And the idea is that you leave essentially light behind you. This glass facade is looking out towards a landscape, but it's behind you as you move into the main ceremony chamber. And the family comes in from the side through this kind of thick wall, this pochette space, which then insulates, of course, the proceedings that are going on here from the private spaces on either side. And when you come in, there's a skylight above you. So now the light has gone from behind you to being above you. This kind of altar-like piece is actually also an AV booth, because the notion for this space is to not only be used for conventional services, but also there increasingly people want to play Madonna, Bruce Springsteen, all sorts of things at these events, and they also want to show multimedia. A lot of people want to kind of show home movies and so on and so forth. So this was all news to us. It's also non-denominational, or I should say actually it's multi-denominational. So it should accommodate all sorts of faiths. So we're really excited to begin to think about how we're going to treat all of these surfaces and begin to address some of the peculiarities and particularities of different kind of rituals that might take place. And some are anticipated already. For instance, the Hindu faith wants to see the body actually being cremated, so this back of house actually has to be nicer than just back of house, and it has to be directly connected to the ceremonial space and so on and so forth. And then this space has to be obviously subdivided so that it can be for a very large gathering, but if there's a small family, they might just want an intimate space without feeling like they're in a huge hall. And so there's all kinds of things built into that. But the essential thing is that you come in here and you join the family in this room. The light leaves from behind you, is above you. As you move out of the chamber, the light is somewhat up, but starts moving in front of you. You come around out these doors towards what's called the consolation space, which is essentially where they have receptions. And there's an indoor courtyard that's not really accessible. It's just kind of a light well where the window is only essentially up to about 2.5 feet above the floor. And then it's kind of semi-translucent glass. So then light is beside you, and then finally the light is in front of you overlooking this park and the canal. And then you leave back out this way. So the whole process of going through this ceremony and this event is about the kind of notion of the changing relationship of light and space, scale, intimacy, and so on and so forth. And this is just a kind of this is the basement plan. One of the conundrums is people come in and they leave their coats here, but they leave over there, but they can't come back and get their coats because another family's come in already. It's sort of like mass production. So you have to bring the coats underground. It's like the cathedrals in New York where there's like one bride getting out of a car on the steps, somebody going in the door, somebody saying their vows, and somebody going out the back door. And the worst case scenario is that also happens in these kinds of circumstances. So that notion of the kind of flow of multiple parties being at different points in the process simultaneously was also something that we had to deal with, which, not being a kind of experienced in this type of building before was kind of interesting to discover. So this gives you a kind of view of like the light penetrating into the room here, the light coming down from above here, whoops, being up here beside you and down here and then out towards the front. And then here's the kind of form that's we've been working with. There's an idea about looking at milled stone to make essentially the sides, the perimeter, and then the center part here would essentially be, I don't know, some kind of metal that would almost be like the opposite of the Hydropier building, that would almost be like a metal roof that would be flowing in between these kind of very solid carved containing walls on either side. And the sides kind of peel up at various points so that from the families' gathering places, they can overlook the landscape and overlook the canal in this area here. And the family has a very, this is actually the main direction out. There's all sorts of tricky things, like you have a funeral going on and somebody has to meet about getting an urn for a recently deceased person, and they have to go into a separate entrance. It's very similar to planning a courthouse where judges, lawyers, public, prisoners, they can't cross paths. And so again here, like the family has its own way out, so again the paths aren't crossed, and it should be something that's very dignified and has a kind of very nice spiritual quality about it. This is some preliminary, this is just sketch phase right now. We're going into schematic design next month. This is going over the canal. Okay, this is the last project, and it's very brief. We were commissioned as the architects to design the Venice Biennale. It was kind of an exciting project to do, to be an architect for other architects. It was a challenge to work with, Italian bureaucracy at the same time. And the theme was interesting. It was called Metamorph, and we had all sorts of ambitions and kind of a lot of interesting discussions with Kurt Forster, who was the curator at the time, was the curator for this show. And we had some great many ambitions, some of which got built and some which didn't. And in the end, most of our contribution was concentrated in what's called the Arsenal, or the Corderia building, which is a 1,000-foot-long hall. And in this space, there were over 200 architects or architectural projects were displayed. And it was quite a challenge because the curator didn't come on until very late in the game, so we had to start designing before the show was curated. So we had to kind of be very flexible and essentially, create some kind of condition that could be populated in whatever kind of way the curator wanted. It also had to be somehow economical, of course. Seems a familiar refrain in this lecture. Constructible within a very short time frame. But for us, one of the most interesting challenges was this notion of this 1,000-foot-long space that has these columns kind of marching all the way through it. So there's about 5 or 6 rooms that are all in a row like a chain. And over the years, there's been different responses to how you deal with this very long space. And this space used to be used for actually making ropes. Corderia means rope making, and ropes in Italian. And this used to be a very active part of a very active shipyard in the 16th century. And they made the ropes here, and they needed these long spaces to twist the ropes to make them strong and sturdy enough for all of these big ships that were being built for all sorts of countries and cultures at the time. And so this notion of the ropes kind of twisting through the space was very inspiring to us, and we started mapping that idea of these ropes twisting and generating essentially a kind of belly-like condition, as though the ropes twisting through the space was almost generating a form through that activity. And as opposed to many other attempts in the recent past, particularly in the art biennales, we decided to play with the perspective because it's so unusual that you would have a 1,000-foot-long space, although you guys probably had one here before this space got broken up. How do you begin to work with that and against it at the same time? So you kind of use the uniformity of the space to then play off a kind of game of difference, or a game of morphing or metamorphing, as the theme suggests. So these are some of the early studies that begin to show how we generated these display trays. They got nicknamed gondolas, which I'm not very happy about, but that's okay. And so there's all these different kinds of heights that are available for curating models and placing them at different levels depending on what's desirable, and a series of walls along the sides that are very flexible. And the idea was that you would kind of emphasize this space and create essentially a kind of sauntering path that one could move through very carefully and be looking at the works, or allow a kind of very quick way of walking by. And then of course the geometry of these allowed in certain areas for hanging models to be displayed on some of the sides. So it was a way to kind of activate a very kind of staid and symmetrical space through very kind of simple means. We again had to kind of streamline the design and find a way to use repetitive geometries to make the manufacturing very efficient, because it had to be made very quickly. These are again some of the model pictures. These are showing all the varieties of forms that were essentially mass produced, the nature of the drawings that had to be generated. And then to display the projects, what we really wanted to do was to allow them, much again like the store, is to allow them almost to float. I mean, we weren't going to try and pretend there was no support. We weren't really into trying to convey their pyrotechnics going on, but just that you would see this kind of field of model display bases creating a space in and of itself, and then allowing the architectural models to sort of float above that. And you can see here, they're just all these boxes, because all we had were sort of overall dimensions given by all the architects, which were incredibly inaccurate, it turns out. So it was a little bit of a crazy time in the last few days trying to accommodate everything. But in the end, it worked out quite well. And here, this conceptual drawing just shows a kind of traces of the generating lines that are kind of allowing this fluidity of space to be created. And here's some construction. Here's very foreshortened, so these columns appear very close together, but they're actually about 20 feet apart. And you can sort of see, I think we're in the second last room, so you can see one of the last rooms already. And you can see how the kind of continuity of the form, which has then been kind of cut up, gets implied when you're walking through the space, as though it's a kind of a continuous wave surface that's moving through. And then you see the variety of conditions that can arise, and then the kind of space that's created on either side for viewing the drawings, and then the models that are just sort of supported on very thin vertical supports floating above. And here again, you can sort of get a sense of the space in between, and the space from above. Okay, I think I've talked for my hour and a half, so I'll leave it at that, and just thank you very much.